This is the new 85mm 1.4 G Master version 2 from Sony. I know what everyone is thinking. I know the elephant in the room. Why isn't this an f1.2? Sony actually answered this question. I'll touch on that later, but we gotta first focus on what's going on here. Okay, this lens took 8 years to update this lens. Usually G Master lenses are updated between 5 to 7 years, so it took a little bit longer. And of all the lenses, this is the one that actually needed the most updating. The original 85 1.4 GM, I dubbed it my bread and butter lens. If you're an OG watcher of the channel, you know that I did a lot of work with this lens when it was announced. And even since launch, this lens had issues. Autofocus, it had a grinding noise in the autofocus mechanism.
And I noticed something that I didn't like, and there's something might be wrong with my copy or with all the copies. There's something really weird going on. Listen.
But over time, this lens has failed me due to the build quality. The lens mount warped. I sent it back to Sony. They said, you might as well buy a new one. It's probably going to cost too much to fix. So they refused to fix it. That's fine. You know what? Whatever. This lens has sentimental value to me, but this lens needed some serious updating. And I think it took a little too long. So throughout this time, I've been using the Sigma 85 1.4, and this has been my primary Sony lens for my portraits. And comparing to the new 85 1.4, I mean, this is actually an easy lens recommendation to make comparing these lenses. I can tell you straight up, clear cut, who should get this lens and who should get the Sigma. I went out to the ballpark. I shot some Major League Baseball with the new 85mm. I also shot some portraits here in the studio. Took some comparison shots with the Sigma to show you guys show you what I see and what my recommendation is. But first, let's dive a little deeper into what I captured with this lens.
So in the studio, I shot some portraits that had no business being shot at f1.4. The first thing that I did notice was that the Sony is slightly wider than the Sigma, and I noticed that in all my comparison shots. Second, the Sony is sharper wide open at f1.4, but not by much. Overall, look, I just didn't see much of a difference in performance, or I guess I didn't see any kind of noticeable advantage for the Sony over the Sigma in a studio environment. For sports, this is where the Sony starts to pull away from the Sigma. So first, this has to be one of the snappiest autofocusing lenses that I've ever used. Once you have pressed that shutter, it's instantaneous when it acquires focus. Now, Sony says that this is one of those lenses that can keep up with the A9 III, and it's 120 frames per second burst shooting. This is where the Sigma does struggle. To be fair, most lenses struggle with when subjects are running toward the camera, for example. Second, I can access the full speed of my Sony A1 or even the A9 III if I had it. This is something that the Sigma just can't compete with, or just any other third-party lens can't compete with. Now, comparing the image quality again, you know, I shot the same sequence of photos with the pitcher throwing the ball, and looking at the photos side by side, look, I'm gonna be honest, there isn't much of a difference other than the Sony being slightly sharper in a slightly different tone and rendering, but the images are really similar. For video, this is where you absolutely would want the Sony over the Sigma if you're doing any kind of paid work. So the focus breathing is much better controlled on the Sony. There's still some there, but it's much better controlled. This is one of the weaknesses of the Sigma. The autofocus is much more reliable. It's faster, quicker. It's less jumpy when you're tapping to focus. There's a pretty big gap here in terms of the overall performance. What about things like background blur and flaring? Okay, Sony really emphasized on the briefing call that the background blur of the G Master 2 is insanely fine-tuned, and I forgot how they worded it, but basically we're gonna get some really beautiful background blur. We're not gonna get onion rings, and you know, the bokeh balls, they're gonna stay really circular. It's got 11 aperture blades, right? But in the test shots that I took, in the limited test shots that I took, I couldn't really see much of a difference, if I'm being honest. Nothing really stood out to me and said this is better than the Sigma. I'll tell you what though, if you're shooting against the sun, this is where the G Master 2 has a big advantage. and controlling flaring, ghosting, just shooting against the sun, the Sony is definitely going to be the better option. The Sony G Master 2 only weighs 7 more grams than the Sigma at 642 grams, but it's still about in half an inch longer. Like, okay, so I do like the smaller size of the Sigma, but I've always complained that the barrel design and the sharp edge of the Sigma would press up against my knuckle at times. And for that, even though the Sony is larger, I do prefer the Sony design.
Back to the big question. Why isn't this lens in 85 1.2? Like Canon's, Nikon even has an 85 1.2. When Sony was asked this question on the briefing, their response was that according to the sales, with the 50mm lenses, like the 51.4 and the 1.2, people were buying the f1.4 more than the 1.2. So their numbers indicate that people prefer to save money and also prefer a smaller, lighter lens than have that extra f-stop to their lens and have a much bigger, heavier, more expensive lens. Who am I to say anything? Sony knows what the heck they're doing, clearly. But I could just give my opinion on that. Given that the old 85 1.4 had some build quality issues, some autofocus noise issues, even the lens hood got all messed up. This lens had issues even from the beginning. This lens, in my opinion, should have been updated a couple years ago at least. Given that there aren't many other options at this focal range at f1.4 for Sony right now. This lens, this f1.4 should have come out a couple years ago. And I think that in 2024, we should have got an f1.2. Selfishly, yeah, we should have got an 85 1.2. I think that it was that time to match the other brands. Do I think that Sony's eventually going to release an 85 1.2? I do. Eventually they will, and it'll probably be smaller and lighter than all the other ones.
So the G Master version 2 is superior in almost every way, but that's going to cost you $1,800 versus the Sigma at about $1,000. So who is this lens for? If you shoot sports, do any kind of paid video work, I think it's absolutely worth it, and I wouldn't think twice. If you shoot only portraits and nothing else, I would say it is hard to justify that extra $800.